man on the other end of the line paused before he spoke. "Mr. Harmon, I have to ask you something directly, and I need you to be honest with me." I told him to go ahead. "The property you want us to assess. Your daughter currently lives there with her husband. Are you certain you want to proceed?" I was certain. I'd been certain for 11 days, ever since my daughter looked me in the eye in that hospital room, told me I was being dramatic, and walked out. Let me back up. My name is Vic Harmon. I'm 67 years old. I spent 34 years as a licensed electrician in the Charlotte, North Carolina area. Started as an apprentice at 22, worked my way up, eventually ran my own small contracting business with 3 guys on the crew. Nothing fancy, but I built something, paid off my house on Caldwell Mill Road, put money in a 401k, drove a 10-year-old pickup truck because I had no interest in payments. My wife, Carol Ann, passed 6 years ago from pancreatic cancer, and after that it was just me and my daughter Lee, and eventually her husband Scott. Lee had always been sharp. Got a business degree from UNC Charlotte, married Scott when she was 29. He worked in commercial real estate, talked fast, dressed well, had opinions about wine. I tried to like him. I genuinely tried. The trouble started small, the way it always does. A loan here, a favor there. The first time was 4 years ago. Lee called and said they were short on a down payment for a townhouse. "Just $18,000, Dad. We'll pay you back in a year." I gave it to them without a promissory note because she was my daughter and I trusted her. The year came and went. When I mentioned it, she told me I was keeping score and that it hurt her feelings. The second time was $24,000 for Scott's business opportunity, a franchise concept that never launched. The money disappeared and the subject never came up again. Then there were the smaller things. My truck borrowed for a week and returned with a cracked bumper and no explanation. The Christmas they didn't show up because they'd gone to Hilton Head with friends. The birthday dinner where Scott spent 40 minutes on his phone and Lee spent the other 20 talking about a house in Ballantyne they were eyeing. Still, she was my daughter. I kept quiet and kept giving. Then I had the stroke. It was a Tuesday morning in March. I was at my workbench in the garage, organizing a bin of wire connectors, and all at once the right side of my face went numb and my hand stopped working right. I sat down on the concrete floor because I couldn't trust my legs. I managed to get my phone out and dial 911. The paramedics came fast. By the time I reached Atrium Health, I'd lost partial function in my right hand and my speech was slurring badly. It was not a massive stroke. The doctors called it a moderate ischemic event. Frightening, but survivable with rehab. I'd be in the hospital for at least 5 days, maybe 7, while they ran tests and started physical therapy. Lee and Scott arrived 3 hours after I was admitted. She came in, looked at me in the hospital bed with tubes in my arm and my right hand still trembling, and her first words were, "The doctors say you'll be fine." Not a question. Not I was so scared or thank God I got here. A statement, like she was already closing the file. Scott stood near the door with his hands in his pockets, nodding at nothing in particular. They stayed 40 minutes. Lee told me she'd have to rearrange her schedule because of this, that she had a big client presentation that week. Scott mentioned that parking at the hospital was ridiculous. Before she left, she leaned down and said, "You need to start thinking about what happens next, Dad. You can't live alone in that big house anymore. It's not safe." Then they were gone. I lay there and listened to the sound of the cardiac monitor and thought about Carol Ann, about how she would have camped in that room for a week straight. I thought about all the hours I'd spent alone in that house since she died, filling the quiet with work, with projects, with keeping busy enough not to notice. I thought about my daughter and tried to find the person she used to be somewhere inside the woman who just walked out. She called the next day, once. A 4-minute call during which she told me the doctors had said I'd be fine, again, and that she was looking into options. I asked her what options she meant. She said, "Senior living communities. Some really nice ones have opened up in the area. We can talk about it when you're out." Then she had to go. She did not call on day 3. On day 4, my occupational therapist, a woman named Bernadette, who had the steady, no-nonsense manner of someone who'd seen everything, noticed I hadn't had any visitors. "Family's busy," I told her. She just nodded. but I could tell she was filing that information away somewhere. On day 5, I had a lot of time to think. Real thinking, the kind you do when you've got nothing but ceiling tiles and the hum of medical equipment. And what I thought about was this. My daughter hadn't just failed to show up, she'd been planning. The comments about the house. You can't live alone in that big house anymore. It had come too fast, too smooth, like a line she'd rehearsed. She'd had that conversation before, just not with me. My house on Caldwell Mill Road is a 3-bedroom ranch on just under an acre. I've been told it's worth somewhere between $420,000 and $440,000 in today's market, possibly more. I'd paid it off completely 8 years ago. I had no debt. I had a retirement account, investments, a small whole life insurance policy. I was not wealthy, but I was comfortable, and everything I had was going to go somewhere when I died. I started making calls from my hospital bed. The first was to a man named Ted, who'd been my accountant for 15 years, and had also become something close to a friend. I told him what had happened, what Lee had said, what I suspected. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Vic, do you want me to look into something for you?" I said yes. He had a contact, a private investigator named Al, who worked mostly domestic cases. Ted gave me the number. The second call was to my attorney, a methodical man named George Whitfield, who had written my will years ago after Carol Ann passed. I told George I wanted to revisit the estate documents. He asked if something had changed. I told him I thought it might have. He said to come in when I was discharged and we'd go over everything. The third call I made surprised even me. It was to a woman named Sandra, who ran a property management company I'd done electrical work for years ago. We'd kept in touch, traded referrals. Sandra was sharp and discreet. I told her I needed a quiet property assessment, value, condition, an objective look. She asked when. I said as soon as possible. That was when she asked me if I was sure, given that my daughter lived there. I told her my daughter lived in the house with her husband. I lived there too. It was my house, and I needed to know exactly what it was worth. Sandra came to the house the following week while I was still in rehabilitation. I'd given her a key from the spare set I kept at Ted's office. She walked the property, took photos, ran the comps. Her written assessment landed in my email on a Thursday morning. $431,000 current market value, well-maintained, strong resale potential. She'd also, without being asked, noted that there appeared to be a new sectional couch in the living room, a refrigerator that wasn't mine in the garage, plugged in and running, and boxes in the second bedroom with Scott's name on them. They had been moving things in. Not everything, not yet, but it was starting. Gradually, the way a tide comes in, slowly enough that you might not notice until the water's around your ankles. Al, the investigator, sent his preliminary report while I was doing hand exercises in my occupational therapy session. I read it that evening. Lee and Scott's joint credit card debt was $43,000. Their mortgage on the townhouse was $3,100 a month, and according to public records, they were behind by 2 payments. Scott's commercial real estate work had slowed significantly. 2 deals had fallen through in the past 6 months, and his commission income was a fraction of what it had been. They were in trouble. Real trouble. The part that turned my stomach was on page 4. Al had found a communication chain, social media messages not encrypted, between Lee and her friend from college. Lee had told her friend, 3 weeks before my stroke, that she was pretty sure Dad is going to need memory care within the next year, and that she'd already been in contact with a real estate agent about the Caldwell Mill property. The messages were matter-of-fact, almost businesslike, like she was discussing the liquidation of an asset, not the house her mother picked out, not the place where Lee learned to ride a bike in the driveway. An asset. What I felt reading that was not rage exactly. It was something quieter and colder. The kind of feeling you get when you finally understand something you've been refusing to see for a long time. I've had 34 years of walking into buildings and finding problems people had been covering up for years. Overloaded panels, scorched wiring, code violations buried inside the walls. You learn to recognize the signs. The smell of something wrong before you can see it. The slight discoloration that means something's been burning for a while. My daughter hadn't become someone different overnight. I just finally stopped looking away. George Whitfield and I met at his office on a Friday morning 2.5 weeks after I was admitted to the hospital. I walked in with a cane, which I probably need for another month. My right hand was still weaker than I'd like, but improving. George offered coffee and I accepted it because the conversation we were about to have was going to take a while. We spent 3 hours restructuring everything. The will was first. Carol Ann and I had left everything to Lee. That was reasonable when we wrote it, years ago, when Lee was a different person, or when I was still willing to believe she was. Now the primary beneficiaries would be 2 charitable organizations, the Charlotte chapter of Habitat for Humanity, where I'd volunteered for years doing electrical work on new builds, and a scholarship fund at the community college program, where I'd done my journeyman training, which had recently started a fund to help low-income students get into the trades. Good work. Work that mattered. Lee was not mentioned. The second thing we set up was a revocable living trust. George was clear that this wouldn't be ironclad in every scenario, but it would make a challenge significantly more difficult and expensive for anyone who tried. He also drafted an amendment to deed that formalized my sole ownership of the Caldwell Mill property and removed any informal language from previous documents that might be construed as a shared interest. If your daughter tries to challenge this, George said, capping his pen, she'll need a lawyer, a filing fee, and a compelling argument. She has none of those things. I also called the real estate agent Lee had apparently contacted. I posed as a homeowner considering listing. Through a few careful questions, I confirmed that Lee had reached out, that she described herself as a co-owner of the property, and that she'd been getting preliminary valuation numbers. She was not a co-owner. She had never been a co-owner. That was the kind of thing that had a legal name. Al's full report arrived on Saturday. Lee had no independent financial cushion to speak of, no savings account with meaningful balance, no investments. Everything she had was leveraged or borrowed. Scott's business entity had 2 outstanding judgments against it from contractors he hadn't paid. The picture was not of 2 people living slightly beyond their means. It was of 2 people who had quietly decided that my house was their solution and were waiting for me to become incapacitated enough to stop fighting it. I spent the rest of the weekend resting. My hand exercises, my speech drills. The stroke had left me with a subtle difficulty on certain words, and Bernadette had given me a set of daily exercises to rebuild the pathways. I did all of them, twice. There is a particular kind of motivation that comes from someone assuming you're done. I was not done. Leigh called on Sunday evening. First time in 6 days. She asked how I was feeling, whether I was getting around okay, and then moved without much transition into asking if I'd given any more thought to the senior living idea. I told her I'd been thinking about a lot of things. She said she and Scott had actually toured one community on my behalf, just to get a sense of the options. It's really beautiful, Dad, almost like a resort. I thanked her and said I'd keep it in mind. I did not mention George Whitfield. I did not mention Al. I did not mention Sandra or the property assessment or the messages she'd sent her friend about memory care. I told her I was tired from therapy and got off the call. I sat in my recliner for a while after that, the house quiet around me, Carol Ann's reading lamp still on the side table where she left it. The room felt like something I needed to hold on to, not because of what it was worth, because of what it was. I called Ted that night and told him I was ready for the next step. 3 days later, I drove myself to the meeting. My right hand wasn't quite back, so I took the back roads to avoid highway traffic, but I drove myself. I arrived at Ted's office at 9 in the morning. George Whitfield was already there, and so was a man named Ray, a forensic accountant Ted knew who specialized in financial fraud cases. I shook everyone's hand and sat down. We were there to discuss whether the pattern Al had documented, Lee describing herself as a co-owner of property she had no legal interest in, constituted fraud. Ray was measured about it. He said the communication with the real estate agent alone might be characterized as misrepresentation. If she had gone further, if she had signed anything, obtained financing under that premise, or transferred any money based on that claim, the exposure would increase significantly. Has she done any of those things? He asked. I said I didn't know yet. Al was still looking. George said what mattered more in the immediate term was that I was protected. The trust was filed. The will was updated. The property was documented as solely mine. If she pushes, he said, you are in a strong position. She knows nothing about any of this yet. That last part was deliberate. I wasn't ready for her to know. Not yet. Al's follow-up report came that Thursday. Lee had not signed anything with the real estate agent. She'd had 2 more phone calls, most recently requesting a formal comparative market analysis when we're ready to move forward. She had used the word "we" again, but she had not executed any documents. Ray said that narrowed the exposure, though it didn't eliminate it entirely. What it meant practically was that the situation could still be resolved without legal action if Lee chose to step back. I didn't think she would choose that, but I wanted to give her the chance. On a Monday morning, 12 days after our meeting at Ted's office, I called Lee and asked her and Scott to come for dinner on Saturday. She sounded pleased, maybe a little surprised. I hadn't invited them over in months. She said, of course. 6 o'clock, she'd bring dessert. I spent the days before Saturday doing normal things. Finished a small wiring job for a neighbor who'd been waiting. Went to a Habitat volunteer day and hammered subfloor in a new build in East Charlotte with a crew of people 20 years younger than me who didn't mind that my right hand was still rebuilding its grip. Cooked a pot of red beans and rice on Thursday evening. Carol Ann's recipe, the one she made every time something needed to be celebrated or mourned. Saturday evening, Lee arrived at 6:15 with a store-bought pie. Scott came in behind her, looking like a man who'd rehearsed something. They sat at the kitchen table, and I put food on the table, and for a little while we talked about nothing. Scott's car, the weather, a road construction project that had been snarling traffic near their townhouse. Lee complimented the red beans. Then there was a knock at the door. She didn't know George Whitfield. I told her I had an old friend coming for dinner. George came in, accepted a bowl of red beans, and sat down at the table. The conversation shifted. I set my fork down. Lee, I said, I want to talk about the house. Her face did the thing I recognized, the careful neutralizing, the slight forward lean that means someone is about to manage a situation. Of course, Dad. We've been worried about. I know you've been in contact with the real estate agent, I said. I know you describe yourself as a co-owner. The table went quiet. Scott looked at his bowl. Lee's expression did several things in rapid succession. Surprise, recalibration, the beginning of an explanation. I was just getting information, Dad. I wasn't going to do anything without talking to you first. We've just been concerned, with the stroke and the costs of care. You told your friend you expected me to need memory care within the year, I said. You reached out to the agent 3 weeks before the stroke, before anything had changed with my health. I let that sit for a moment. You were planning this? Scott started to speak. George Whitfield looked at him and he stopped. Lee's voice changed. The management tone dropped and something rawer came through. We're in trouble, Dad. Financially. You don't know what it's been like. Scott's business has been. I know exactly what it's been like, I said quietly. I had someone look. Another silence. Longer this time. The house is mine, I said. It was always mine. Your name is not on the deed, was never on the deed, and any suggestion otherwise to a third party is something that has a legal name. George is here tonight because he's my attorney, and he's going to explain to you what has already been done to protect this property and my estate. George opened his folder. He didn't dramatize it. He laid out the trust, the updated will, the documentation of sole ownership, the same even way he did everything. Lee stared at the table. Scott had gone the color of old dishwater. When George finished, I said, I am not doing this to punish you. I'm doing this because you made a decision about my life without asking me. You decided I was done. You started planning around my death like I was already gone. My voice was steady, which surprised me. 34 years of delivering bad news to homeowners had given me practice. I am not gone. I'm sitting right here. Lee looked up. Her eyes were wet. Dad, I'm sorry. We didn't know what else to do. You could have come to me, I said. You could have said, we're struggling. You could have called more than once in 7 days when your father was in the hospital. That would have been a start. She didn't have an answer to that. Scott was looking at his hands. I told them both to finish eating because I wasn't going to waste a pot of red beans on a hard conversation. And so we did, the four of us, in a silence that was uncomfortable but honest, which is sometimes the best you can manage. After they left, George said, "That was well handled." "I don't know yet," I said. He picked up his briefcase. "You'll know in a few months. People tend to show you who they're going to be pretty quickly once the options narrow." He was right about that. He was right about a lot of things. The weeks that followed were quiet. Lee called 3 times, once to apologize again, once to say she and Scott were seeing a financial counselor, once just to check in, which she hadn't done unprompted in longer than I could easily recall. The calls were short, a little stiff, still finding their footing. I answered all of them. I didn't keep score out loud. Scott sent me a text, just once, no call, that said he was sorry for his part in it. 3 sentences, no punctuation. I read it twice and set the phone down. I didn't respond that day. I responded the next morning. Short, neutral, not warm, but not closed. He didn't text again. Maybe that was enough. Or maybe it wasn't, and we'd find out. I went back to the Habitat site on Saturdays. Bernadette had cleared me for full activity, and my grip was almost entirely back. I was pulling wire again, making connections, doing the work I'd done for 30 years. There is something about doing that work, the precision of it, the way it has to be right. Because if it isn't, something burns, that has always made sense to me in a way most other things don't. I didn't change the well back. Maybe one day. Or maybe Habitat for Humanity would get a nice bequest, and a new generation of kids who needed the trades would have a little less standing between them and a future. There were worse things to leave behind. I was still in my house on Caldwell Mill Road. My house, with Carol Ann's lamp on the side table and the driveway where Lee learned to ride a bike, and 34 years of tools in the garage that I still knew how to use. I was still here, still working, still making things function that might otherwise fail. I had not needed memory care. I had not needed managing. What I'd needed was to finally stop pretending I didn't see the smoke, and to trust that I still knew what to do when I found it. I think about something Bernadette said to me near the end of my rehab sessions. She was watching me work through a grip exercise, the kind where you squeeze a soft ball over and over until your hand remembers what it's supposed to do. And she said, almost to herself, "The people who come back fastest are the ones who still have something to prove." I didn't respond at the time, but I've thought about it a lot since. What I had to prove wasn't anything dramatic. It wasn't that I was smarter than my daughter, or that I'd won something. It was simpler than that. I had to prove to myself that I still knew the difference between what was right and what was easy, and that I still had the spine to act on it. The stroke took things from me. It took weeks of full mobility, some confidence, a sense of physical invincibility I hadn't even known I still carried. What it gave me, in exchange, was clarity. When you're lying in a hospital bed running grip tests and watching your daughter not call for 6 days, you stop making excuses for people. You stop filling in the gaps with explanations that are more comfortable than the truth. You see what's there. I've worked in people's homes for 34 years. I've opened walls and found wiring that should have burned the whole structure down years ago. Scorched insulation, overloaded circuits, connections that held together by luck and nothing else. The homeowners almost never knew. They'd been living with the danger for so long it felt like normal. And when I'd show them, explain what had been hidden inside their own walls, the most common reaction wasn't anger. It was a kind of stunned recognition. Of course, that's what it was. That's what it felt like with Lee. Not a surprise exactly, a recognition of something I'd been refusing to name. What I did in the weeks after that hospital stay wasn't revenge. I want to be clear about that, at least to myself. I didn't move to hurt her. I moved to stop enabling the kind of thinking that had led her to believe she could plan around my death like I was an inconvenience to be managed. The difference matters. Revenge is about making someone feel what you felt. What I did was about drawing a line, finally, and deciding that my life, the house I paid off, the money I saved, the years I still have, belonged to me and to the work and people that had earned it. George used to say that the most enforceable contracts are the ones nobody ever has to take to court, because they're built so solidly that the other party understands immediately. There's no angle. That's what I was after. Not punishment. Solidity. Leigh is still out there, still figuring out who she is without a financial safety net she'd been quietly banking on for years. That's hard. I don't pretend otherwise. But hard is not the same as wrong. Sometimes the most decent thing you can do for someone is refuse to protect them from the consequences of their own choices. I spent too many years protecting Leigh from that. The loans I forgave. The behavior I excused. The visits I kept initiating even when she stopped meeting me halfway. I called it love. Some of it was. Some of it was just fear of what I'd have to face if I stopped. What I know now is that real steadiness, the kind that holds when things get difficult, doesn't come from pretending everything is fine. It comes from seeing clearly and acting anyway, even when it costs you something. Even when what it costs you is a version of your daughter you'd been hoping still existed somewhere. I'm still doing the hand exercises. I'll probably do them the rest of my life. You work to rebuild what you lost, and then you keep working to make sure it holds. That's all any of us can do.